I don't care if you fought in Iraq, the flight attendant snapped, her voice cutting through the cabin like cold metal. Either move to 29B or we delay the entire flight. Your choice, sir. Colonel Frank Delaney didn't respond right away. He just looked at her, steadily, without flinching. Not because he was trying to make a point, but because it took time to move now. That's what no one seemed to understand. His left hip, rebuilt twice since 2005, wasn't just painful. It was precision engineered to barely let him board a plane. That's why he'd booked seat 2D, an aisle seat in business class, paid for with his own pension. Not because he wanted extra legroom, because he needed it to survive a 4-hour flight without locking up like steel. I'd like it noted, he said calmly, voice even and low, that I'm being removed from a medically necessary seat, under pressure. The flight attendant folded her arms. Sir, the family of 4 needs this row. They're already standing in the galley. Frank glanced forward. A young mother held a toddler on her hip. 2 other kids clung to her sides. She didn't meet his eyes. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats. The silence around him thickened. You could feel it. The unspoken judgment, the silent headlines forming in their minds. Old man refuses to help mom with kids. No one saw the cane tucked beneath his seat. No one noticed the scar above his collarbone from when he'd pulled a radio operator out of a flaming MRAP. He took a breath and slowly unbuckled his belt. My name is Colonel Frank Delaney, he said as he stood, gripping the headrest for balance. United States Army, retired. I paid for this seat 3 months ago due to injuries sustained in active duty, and I'm moving. Not because I should, but because no one here is willing to stand for what's right. The flight attendant didn't answer. She was already turning to signal the mother forward. Frank didn't wait to be dismissed. He reached for his cane, nodded once toward the toddler, who offered a confused little wave, and made his way down the aisle. His gait was slow, limping, but his back was straight. Tell us where you're watching from, and what you would have done if this was your father. Seat 29B was hell. No legroom, no view. Sandwiched between a headphone-wearing college kid watching anime and a middle-aged man in khakis who'd already claimed the armrest like it was land in a war zone. Frank settled in with a sharp wince as his hip screamed at the tighter angle. The air smelled like overused sanitizer and weak coffee. His hands folded across his stomach, the cane tucked beneath the seat. He didn't speak. He never did. 3 rows ahead, someone was watching. Charlotte Hayes had boarded quietly. Former military ethics attorney, now an advisor to the Department of Defense's Air Logistics Oversight Board. She wasn't famous, but she knew people, and more importantly, she knew protocol. She'd watched the entire exchange from the beginning. Noticed the way the flight attendant barely blinked when Frank mentioned combat injury. Now, she opened a secure line on her phone and typed, Passenger Frank Delaney forcibly removed from seat 2D despite documented injury. Crew uncooperative. Ethics escalation requested. Immediate attention. She hit send, then watched him. Still, silent, his shoulders drawn tight like coiled metal. She didn't know who he really was, not yet, but she knew enough to know this wasn't some cranky old man. Frank closed his eyes and let the hum of the cabin settle around him. He counted his breaths like he used to before missions. 2. He thought of his porch back in Rock Springs, Wyoming, of the chipped coffee mug that still sat by the window, of the flag folded neatly in a case by his fireplace. He didn't think of the war, not if he could help it, but the pain brought it back anyway. The jungle, the sand, the rotator blades, the static over the comms, the time he crawled through broken glass to reach a downed corporal still screaming for his mother. He shifted again. His hip crunched slightly under the weight of memory and misalignment. The man beside him didn't notice. The kid kept watching his anime. Frank wasn't angry. He was used to it. The cabin began to quiet for takeoff. Final safety checks were in progress. The same flight attendant walked by him twice, never once looked down. He may as well have been part of the seat, but something was happening up front. Inside the cockpit, Captain Brian Torres, 46, tapped twice on his screen. Passenger alert. Frank Delaney flagged. Ethics violation reported authority level DMLC clearance code, Tier 1. Brian blinked. No way. That Frank Delaney? He tapped once more. The file opened. Confirmed. Colonel Frank Delaney, retired command officer, former regional director of United States Army Logistics Operations, EUCOM, current civilian oversight director for the $1.4 billion DMLC Military Transport Fund. The man in 29B was the final approver of every logistics contract the airline held with the Department of Defense. Brian stood from his chair. "Tell Tower we're holding at gate," he said to his co-pilot. "I need 3 minutes. You're delaying takeoff. I'm correcting a mistake." Back in row 29, Frank shifted again. Not from pain this time, from the sound. Footsteps, measured, heavy. They weren't a flight attendant's steps. They were boots. Someone in uniform. He opened his eyes. Captain Brian Torres stood tall in the aisle, silver bars on his chest, eyes level. "Colonel Delaney," he said formally. "Permission to address?" Frank stared, confused. "Do I know you?" "Lieutenant Brian Torres, sir. Camp Arifjan. You signed my transfer papers. 2011. Frank blinked slowly. "I remember." Captain Torres straightened fully, and then, without hesitation, saluted sharply in full view of the entire cabin. The air shifted. Phones stopped scrolling. A child turned in their seat. Frank looked stunned, then glanced around. What's happening?" The captain spoke clearly. "Sir, on behalf of this crew, and in respect to your service, I offer our sincere apology. You should not have been asked to move, and it's my responsibility to make that right." Frank opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Captain Torres turned to the aisle and said, "Miss Bennett, please step forward." The flight attendant, now clearly pale, appeared from the galley. "You will personally escort Colonel Delaney to seat 1A. If that seat is taken, you will inform the passenger that the captain is invoking federal ethics protocol for reassignment." She didn't argue. She just nodded. Frank sat still for a beat longer, then slowly began to rise. This time, no one sighed. The businessman beside him stood first. The college kid removed his headphones, and for the first time in hours, Frank Delaney moved without pain. Charlotte Hayes had seen a lot in her life. Courtrooms, congressional hearings, ethics inquiries that went nowhere. But nothing compared to this. An entire aircraft cabin frozen in silence while a U.S. Army colonel was saluted by the pilot in the middle of economy class. She didn't touch her phone this time. She didn't need to. Some things were too sacred to document. Frank Delaney stood slowly, steadied by the pilot himself. Captain Brian Torres gently touched the old man's elbow, not in pity, but in respect. Around them, heads were bowed. A few passengers wiped their eyes. One man across the aisle placed a hand over his heart. The flight attendant, Miss Kayla Bennett, the one who had ordered Frank to move, stood stiff by the galley door. Her tablet trembled in her hand. Captain Torres turned to her, his tone steady but public. "Miss Bennett, seat 1A. Kayla blinked. "Yes, Captain." "If that seat is occupied, ask for a volunteer. If no one moves, explain that the captain of this aircraft is requesting it on behalf of a decorated combat veteran. If that still fails, you are authorized to reassign the seat." Kayla hesitated, then nodded and disappeared toward first class. Frank didn't speak as he followed, not because he had nothing to say, because his throat had closed tight. For a man used to pain, this wasn't the kind that came from the body. This was the kind that came from finally being seen. As they passed through the rows, the energy shifted. No one dared look away anymore. The businessman who'd hogged the armrest stood up, stepped back. "Sir," he said, voice tight. "I didn't realize." The college kid muttered, "Sorry, sir," and took his headphones off like a student being called out in class. Frank just nodded as he moved, one aisle, one row at a time, and yet it felt like a long walk home. At the front of the plane, 1A was, in fact, already taken. A man in his 40s, golf polo and brand-name headphones, lounging with a cup of branded water, looked up confused as Kayla approached. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, quieter than before. "We'll need to reassign your seat. Captain's request." The man blinked. "Wait, what?" Kayla stepped aside, and Frank appeared behind her. The man's eyes dropped to the duffel bag, the cane, the military pins, the age on Frank's face. He didn't say another word. He stood. "It's an honor, sir," he said simply. Frank gave a slight nod. "Thank you, son." Captain Torres glanced back at Kayla. His tone softened, but only slightly. "If that seat had not been given," he said loud enough for several rows to hear, "I would have reassigned my co-pilot's jump seat, and if that wasn't available," he paused, "I would have given up mine." Kayla's mouth parted just slightly, but she said nothing. Frank lowered himself carefully into 1A. It wasn't the legroom that got him, or the leather, or even the quiet. It was the dignity of the thing. The return to a space where he wasn't an inconvenience, where he didn't have to apologize for simply being here. A clean blanket was handed to him. A new bottle of water. No fuss, just gentle hands and no unnecessary words. He let his cane rest beside him, closed his eyes for a moment. He was ready for the plane to take off, but it didn't. Not yet. Over the PA, the captain's voice crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "before we depart, I'd like to make a brief statement." Silence. Total silence. Brian Torres took a breath. Today, this flight failed a man who served this country, a man who bears both the visible and invisible scars of that service. He was asked to give up his seat, not because of airline error, not because of a safety issue, but because of a policy that prioritized convenience over honor. He paused. Let it sit. Frank stared straight ahead. Captain Torres continued. "Let me be clear. We don't take off while injustice sits quietly in our cabin. Not a sound from the passengers." Brian's voice softened. "The man you just saw is Colonel Frank Delaney, retired U.S. Army. He served in Vietnam, Iraq, and oversaw operations in conflict zones you'll never hear about on the news. He didn't ask for special treatment. He simply asked to keep the seat he booked, so his hip, shattered in combat, wouldn't lock up mid-air. He waited again, then slowly, and we failed him." The moment hung in the air, and then it shifted. One pair of hands began to clap, then another, and another, until the entire plane, every row, was applauding. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forced. It was reverent. Charlotte Hayes had tears in her eyes. She hadn't meant to cry, but there was something in the way it all unfolded. The humiliation, the silence, the shift, the respect reclaimed. It struck a chord deep in her chest that she didn't even realize had grown numb over the years. She pulled out her phone again, opened a blank note, and began to write. He didn't ask to be honored. He just asked to be seen. Back in the cockpit, Captain Torres sat back down, adjusted his headset, and gave the all-clear for taxi. But something strange happened before they pushed back. His screen lit up. A notification from the Department of Defense. Urgent DMLC liaison. Frank Delaney has activated red flag status on Trans-Aero Airlines. All military logistics operations with this carrier are suspended effective immediately pending ethics review. Contract value affected. 1.4B flights delayed. 112. Affected installations. Fort Bragg, Dover AFB, Naval Station Norfolk, Camp Pendleton, Ryan. Blinked. He looked toward the front of the plane. Frank wasn't just a veteran. He was the guy who controlled the contracts. Down in 1A, Frank didn't look like a man who had just triggered a $1.4 billion audit. He just sipped the water, tucked the blanket over his knees, closed his eyes. He'd done his part. Quietly. Like always. Later that day, news began to spread, starting with a simple post from a ground agent who overheard the intercom speech. Then came the video from a teenager in row 17 who had recorded the captain's salute. By the time the plane landed, the hashtag #seat for Colonel Delaney was trending nationally. Military wives shared it. Veteran groups reposted it. Even a few current service members quoted it. "We don't fly over dignity, we fly with it." And somewhere deep inside the Pentagon, an aide placed a folder labeled, "The Delaney Protocol Draft. Mandatory ethics standards for civilian military carriers, status, urgent." Review scheduled for committee hearing. Frank didn't check the news when he got off the plane. He didn't take selfies, he didn't post anything. He just walked slowly down the jet bridge, his cane tapping quietly. His granddaughter was waiting at baggage claim, uniform sharp, hair perfect. A hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome home, Grandpa Frank." She ran into his arms. "Your knee," she started. "I've had worse," he smiled. But this time, it reached all the way to his eyes. Charlotte Hayes didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen counter in D.C., still wearing the navy blazer from the flight, her laptop open, a half-finished glass of Merlot untouched. The cursor blinked on the blank document she'd been staring at for an hour. But the story wasn't blank. It was burned into her memory, line by line, moment by moment. She didn't want to dramatize it. She didn't need to. The truth had enough weight on its own. She took a breath and typed, "They made him move. A man who served more years than most of us have lived. A man with a limp, a cane, and a quiet dignity that deserved more than silence. And when no one stood up for him, the captain did. Because justice, real justice, doesn't shout. It walks slowly down an airplane aisle, salutes, and makes things right." She didn't know where the words came from, but once they started, they didn't stop. The piece took 20 minutes to write. She read it twice, didn't change a word. She emailed it to one person, her former editor at the Chronicle Review, a weekly publication with a niche but loyal audience of veterans, policy analysts, and ethics wonks. She didn't expect it to go further than that. By sunrise, it had been reposted 600 times. By noon, it was on the front page of Military Times. By 4:30 p.m., CNN was quoting her paragraph on air. And by evening, the Department of Transportation Ethics Division had released a statement. "We have launched a formal review into civilian military carrier conduct and are working with the Department of Defense to reevaluate policies involving service-related accommodations on federally contracted flights." Meanwhile, at TransAero's corporate headquarters in Atlanta, the legal team was panicking. A full inbox of ethics complaints. Multiple hotline voicemails with direct quotes from the captain's speech. And a new internal message from the Pentagon's liaison office. "Your ethics rating has been temporarily suspended pending the outcome of the Delaney Incident Review. As a result, your military transport operations under the DMLC contract are frozen effective immediately. We expect full cooperation." One executive stared at the numbers. 112 suspended flights. 4 critical military installations affected. $1.4 billion at stake. He didn't need coffee that morning. But Frank Delaney? He was sitting in his backyard in Rock Springs, Wyoming, wearing an old fleece, watching a crow peck at birdseed like nothing had happened. No phone, no news alerts. Just the morning sun and a cane resting beside his chair. He didn't need to know what was happening, because for him, it wasn't about attention. It was about being treated like he mattered. That was enough. His granddaughter, Jessica, however, had other plans. "Grandpa, you're all over the internet," she said, nearly tripping on the back step as she ran out holding her phone. "Like, everywhere. There's even a hashtag." Frank raised an eyebrow. "A what?" "A hashtag. #seat for Colonel Delaney. And look, this video's from a kid like 10 rows behind you. He filmed the whole thing when the captain saluted. Over 4 million views." Frank looked down at the phone. On screen, He saw himself, older than he ever imagined, standing with the help of a younger man in uniform, surrounded by silence, reverence, and something else: respect. He didn't say anything for a long time. Jessica watched him. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said quietly. Then added, I didn't think anyone still noticed." She sat beside him. "They do now." By the end of the week, things had moved fast. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, scheduled an emergency session with key airline executives. TransAero was subpoenaed to provide all internal communications related to passenger accommodation decisions, as well as personnel files for the cabin crew involved in Flight 270. Kayla Bennett's name came up quickly. A second passenger from the same flight had filed a complaint about her tone and refusal to explain policy. The pressure was mounting. And inside one quiet Pentagon office, a man named Major General Ross Fenwick was reading a confidential memo titled, "Proposal: The Delaney Protocol Mandatory Compliance Standards for All Carriers Holding Department of Defense Transport Contracts, drafted by Colonel Frank Delaney, Retire." Ross smiled as he read it. He'd served under Delaney once, 20 years ago. Frank had been firm, no nonsense, and always the first one in and the last one out. And now here he was, holding the industry accountable not through anger or lawsuits, but with the same precision he once used to deploy convoys through hostile territory. Ross signed the cover sheet, forwarded the memo to the Secretary of Defense, and wrote a single line in the body of the email. "He's still leading us, sir, just from a different seat." Back in Wyoming, Frank got a letter in the mail, hand-signed from the Office of the Secretary of Defense. "Colonel Delaney, we regret what happened aboard Flight 270. Your restraint, dignity, and quiet strength have reminded this nation what leadership truly looks like. Enclosed is a certificate designating you as an honorary federal ethics liaison, with full advisory clearance on any and all matters related to veteran protections in federally regulated travel. Thank you for not staying silent. SecDef, United States Department of Defense." Frank folded the letter once, then again, slipped it inside the box where he kept his medals, not on display, but tucked away. The world didn't need to see them. He just needed to know they were still real. Charlotte Hayes received a call 2 days later. "This is CBS. Would you be open to an interview?" She hesitated. "I'm not the story," she said. The producer replied, "You may not be, but you help the world see the one that is." Charlotte agreed, on one condition: that Frank didn't have to say a word. The segment aired the following Sunday. Footage of the salute, a voiceover reading Charlotte's article, B-roll of Frank walking slowly with his cane through the jet bridge. Jessica was crying before the story even reached the halfway mark. Frank just watched quietly, hands folded in his lap, a cup of black coffee in front of him. When the screen faded to black, he said softly, "That'll do." At a diner 2 towns over, a waitress who had never spoken to Frank before walked over, refilled his mug without asking, and placed a napkin beside it with a handwritten note. "My dad served. He passed last year. Thank you for reminding people. This one's on me." Frank didn't know what to say, so he said the same thing he always did when words weren't enough. He nodded, once, and meant it. The oak-paneled hearing room in the Hart Senate office building had seen its share of history, confirmation battles, ethics showdowns, even the occasional scandal. But that morning, it was quiet in a different way. Not tense, not theatrical, just still. Like everyone in the room knew, this wasn't about headlines. It was about restoring something we forgot we owed. Colonel Frank Delaney sat at the front table, straight-backed, navy blazer pressed, a cane resting at his side. His face was calm, unreadable. He didn't fidget, didn't glance at the cameras, didn't adjust the mic. He just waited. Senator Miriam Lawton, chair of the Senate Subcommittee on Military Oversight and Ethics, cleared her throat and leaned into the mic. "Colonel Delaney," she began, "thank you for making the trip to Washington. Frank gave a small nod. Ma'am, we've all seen the footage by now. What happened aboard Transaero Flight 270? You've declined nearly every media interview, but today you've agreed to testify before this committee. May I ask why? Frank paused before answering. Because I don't want a speech, he said, voice steady. I want a standard. The room was silent for a beat. Then Senator Lawton nodded. Colonel, in the days following your incident, the Department of Defense confirmed your role as final approver of the DMLC logistics contracts. Is that accurate? Yes, ma'am. And you personally authorized the temporary freeze of those contracts with Transaero? I did. Why? Frank leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. Because it wasn't just about me. It was about a system that forgets who paid the price for its convenience. That seat I booked wasn't luxury. It was pain management. And when I was asked to give it up, for no valid reason, I realized we've gone too far in treating veterans like background noise. He looked down the row of senators. Policies should protect people who can't fight for themselves anymore, because the people who can, we're getting fewer. Charlotte Hayes sat in the second row, just behind the press box. She'd flown in that morning, at the invitation of the committee, but no one asked her to speak. She didn't mind. She'd already said everything she needed to say in her article. Today was about listening, and watching a man who never asked for a spotlight redefine accountability without raising his voice. Senator Aldridge, a Republican from Georgia and former Navy JAG officer, leaned into his mic. Colonel, can you elaborate on what you're proposing? Frank nodded. Yes, sir. I've submitted a draft policy proposal, the Delaney Protocol, which outlines 3 mandatory changes to all federal civilian transport contracts involving military personnel. He reached into his briefcase and handed a printed copy to the clerk. First, he said, an ethics compliance score tied to real passenger outcomes, not surveys, behavior. Second, a permanent booking protection for all service-connected medical accommodations, regardless of class of service. And third, an accountability mechanism. If a flight crew violates ethics protocol, the carrier is flagged, and military transport operations are frozen for 72 hours pending review. There were murmurs in the room now, whispers, scribbling. But Frank didn't flinch. These rules don't punish, he said. They protect. Senator Lawton smiled slightly. You've been out of uniform for almost 20 years, Colonel. Yet you still sound like a logistics officer. Frank shrugged. I still know how to move things from point A to point B, especially when point B is overdue justice. Back at Transaero headquarters, the mood was different. Their general counsel had just returned from a closed-door session with the Department of Transportation, and it wasn't good news. The FAA wants us to produce all flight logs, passenger complaints, and crew rosters from the past 12 months. She said flatly. And DoD has notified us that if we don't comply with full ethics recertification by end of quarter, we'll be permanently delisted from all federal military contracts. The CEO, a man named Lionel Greer, rubbed his temples. This isn't just about one old man anymore, is it? No, she said. It's about everyone we overlooked along the way. That same night, Frank sat in a quiet corner of his hotel room, overlooking the Capitol Dome. He wasn't someone who traveled often these days. The movement hurt. The beds weren't always kind to his hip, but he'd made an exception for this. Jessica had called him earlier. They read your speech at my ROTC meeting, she said. One of the juniors said she cried. Frank didn't know how to respond. He wasn't trying to be inspiring. He just didn't want anyone else to feel like he had in seat 29B. The next morning, the Washington Post ran a headline, Colonel who was moved now moves Congress, and under it, a quote, Dignity isn't a first-class perk. It's the price we owe for the freedom to fly at all. Colonel Frank Delaney, return. Veteran groups across the country began calling for the Delaney Protocol to be adopted not just by airlines, but by Amtrak, bus lines, even hospital triage systems. A few lawmakers laughed it off. Most didn't. Because deep down, they knew. The story had pierced something old and aching in America. The idea that service should still mean something. And in communities from Pennsylvania to Colorado, strangers approached veterans and said things like, "Saw that colonel on TV. Reminded me of my dad. Thank you, for real this time." Meanwhile, Charlotte got a call from a small public high school in Kansas. "Would you mind if we reprint your article? We want to read it at our Veterans Day assembly." Charlotte smiled. "Of course." Then she asked, "Why that one?" The teacher on the other end said, "Because it doesn't just tell a story, it reminds us who we forgot to thank." Frank returned to Rock Springs 2 days later. At the airport, a gate agent greeted him by name, not because he was famous, because she had watched the full hearing on her phone during a break and cried quietly behind the desk. He didn't ask for special treatment, but she upgraded his seat anyway. And this time, when Frank boarded early, no one rushed him. No one avoided eye contact. No one asked him to move. They just nodded, stepped aside, and let him pass. As he reached 1A, a little boy across the aisle whispered to his dad, "Is he the man from the video?" Frank looked over and gave a slight smile. The boy waved, and for once, Frank waved back. At the Federal Aviation Administration, Commissioner Dalton Price was pacing inside his private conference room. His inbox was overflowing. Letters from veteran advocacy groups, internal memos from the Department of Defense, congressional pressure from both parties demanding swift implementation of the Delaney Protocol. "I understand the optics," he said, voice low but tight. "But we can't let one viral story dictate federal policy." His deputy, Angela Lynn, a sharp, detail-obsessed ethics officer, met his eyes across the table. "With all due respect, sir," she said, "it wasn't just a story. It was a failure, and everyone saw it." Price slammed his folder shut. "What they saw was one pilot grandstanding in a cabin. That's not regulatory justification." Angela didn't flinch. "That grandstanding pilot stopped more flight complaints in a day than we've managed in a quarter." Meanwhile, at Trans-Aero, panic had turned into calculation. CEO Lionel Greer stood in front of a whiteboard covered in numbers, headlines, and flowcharts marked response strategy. "We've got 2 options," he said to the exec team. "Settle this quietly, or go on the offensive." Someone asked, "How do we go on the offensive against a war hero?" Silence. Then Lionel said, "We don't attack the man, we question the policy." That afternoon, a position paper landed in inboxes across Capitol Hill. The Delaney Protocol, a disruption to efficient operations. Published anonymously by a coalition of industry professionals. It argued that the proposed policy was logistically cumbersome, unrealistic in high-density boarding situations, over-prioritizing symbolic gestures over real efficiency. But it didn't cite Frank's name once. The goal wasn't to dispute his experience. It was to reframe the conversation, from justice to inconvenience. Back in Rock Springs, Frank got wind of the pushback through Jessica. She came home from ROTC that evening, red in the face, waving a printed article. "Grandpa, they're trying to spin this like you're the problem, like the system was fine until you overreacted." Frank took the paper, read it once, then folded it slowly. "I've been called worse," he said. "But they're lying," she said. "And you're just letting them?" He looked at her, steady. "Jess, I didn't do this to be famous. I did it so the next man with a cane and a memory doesn't have to explain why he needs 14C. The next day, Charlotte Hayes got a call. It was from a junior staffer on the House Ethics Committee. "We've heard rumblings the FAA might delay implementation," he said. "We're compiling testimony for a follow-up session. Would you be willing to speak?" Charlotte hesitated. She wasn't looking to be in the spotlight, but something told her the story wasn't over yet. She agreed. By the end of the week, 3 more airlines had quietly pledged to adopt the Delaney Protocol standards voluntarily, citing public trust, not regulation. Public trust. The kind of phrase you don't hear often in boardrooms, unless something's shifting. And it was. At a small church gathering in Iowa, a retired Marine stood and said, "For the first time in 20 years, someone in Washington said, 'We failed him,' and actually meant it." At a high school in Florida, a student council voted to rename their annual scholarship the Delaney Award for Quiet Courage. And in the halls of the FAA, Angela Lynn submitted a formal request to create a new division, Federal Passenger Ethics Compliance Office, sponsored by Civilian Military Oversight Partnership. Proposed lead advisor, Colonel Frank Delaney, retired. Frank never asked for any of it, but the system had taken notice, and this time, it wasn't going to get away with silence. The second hearing wasn't televised. There were no opening statements or camera flashes, just a long wooden table, some lukewarm coffee, and a handful of congressional aides trying to keep up as real decisions took shape. This time, Charlotte Hayes sat in the witness chair. No blazer, no script. Just a copy of her article folded neatly in her lap and the calm, pointed clarity of someone who'd spent a lifetime watching systems quietly fail people they were supposed to protect. "Ms. Hayes," asked Representative Cole from Michigan, "as the author of the piece that helped bring this issue national attention, what do you believe the public responded to most?" Charlotte leaned forward, steady. "They didn't respond to outrage," she said. "They responded to recognition." Recognition? Yes. Of a truth most of us live with every day. That too often, we notice injustice only when it's recorded. And even then, we wait to see if the person harmed has enough status to matter. She let that settle. Colonel Delaney didn't ask for status. He asked to be treated with decency, and when he wasn't, the system acted like it was just a hiccup in policy. But the public saw it for what it was, a mirror. At the back of the room, Angela Lynn from the FAA sat quietly, taking notes. She'd been watching Charlotte for weeks, first as a writer, then as a reluctant public voice. And now, it was clear. Charlotte didn't want to lead a movement. She just refused to stay silent. Angela circled a line in her notebook. Not status, just decency. That was the heart of the protocol. And if the FAA couldn't see it, Congress would make sure they did. Meanwhile, across town, Frank Delaney sat in a small office tucked inside the Department of Defense building, reviewing a preliminary draft of something he never thought would carry his name. The Delaney Protocol, Final Form. A regulatory standard for all civilian airlines under federal transport contract. Enforceable Ethics Compliance Score, EECS. Mandatory accommodations for medically documented service-connected needs. 72-hour operational suspension for ethics violations. Federal Passenger Dignity Council, Advisory Oversight Panel. He ran his hand over the cover. No pride, just quiet responsibility. Jessica called during his lunch break. "Did you hear?" she said. "American Eagle just adopted the full protocol voluntarily. No regulation required." Frank chuckled. "They're faster than Congress." "They're more scared of Twitter," she replied. He smiled, then paused. "Jess, I didn't do this so people would like me." She was quiet for a second. "I know, but sometimes the truth needs a face. And whether you like it or not, Grandpa, it's yours." Back on Capitol Hill, word spread fast. The FAA, under pressure from multiple House subcommittees, had agreed to formally adopt the Delaney Protocol, with a condition. They wanted Frank to serve as the inaugural honorary civilian ethics liaison for all military-partnered airlines. It wasn't a flashy title, but it came with something rare: actual oversight authority. And for once, Frank didn't say no. The next Monday, a quiet press release was issued. Colonel Frank Delaney, Attendant, has been appointed Civilian Ethics Liaison under the FAA DoD Passenger Integrity Framework. His service, integrity, and vision helped launch the national standard, now known as the Delaney Protocol. We are honored by his continued commitment to this country. No media blitz, no ceremony, just a line in the Federal Register. and a shift that would echo through every gate and jet bridge in the country. Later that week, Charlotte met Frank for coffee in D.C. It wasn't formal. They didn't even talk much about the hearings. Mostly, they sat outside near the park, watching squirrels chase each other under oak trees. At one point, Charlotte asked, "Do you ever wish it had stayed quiet?" Frank didn't hesitate. "No," he said, "but I do wish it had never been necessary." As the weeks passed, things began to change. Slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. Gate agents stopped brushing off boarding requests from vets. Flight attendants began asking, not telling, when changes were needed. Airline policies were updated with clearer language. Veterans with medical accommodations will not be reassigned without documented consent. And at one small regional airport in Oklahoma, a printed sign went up on the check-in desk. "We honor the seat and the service." Back in Rock Springs, Frank sat on his porch one evening, cane resting against the rail. He wasn't thinking about Congress or policy or headlines. He was thinking about a moment that still lingered in his chest. That flight, that seat, the silence, the salute, the small, still feeling of finally being seen. He didn't ask for it, but now that it had come, he would make sure it meant something, not for him, for whoever came next. The headlines came without warning. Skynova suspended from DoD Transport Network after ethics violation. 480 million contract frozen following passenger incident. The Delaney Protocol had just claimed its first major airline casualty. At a connecting gate in Charlotte, a 72-year-old veteran named Miguel Alvarez had requested to stay seated near the front due to his leg prosthetic. A gate agent told him to stop being dramatic and moved him to the rear. He didn't complain, but someone recorded the conversation, and that someone posted it with the caption, "Same story, different vet, same silence. When does it stop?" The answer? Now. Within 36 hours, Skynova's ethics score dropped to non-compliant. Within 72 hours, their contract with the Department of Defense was formally suspended. And just like that, $480 million vanished off the table. In Rock Springs, Jessica burst into the living room holding her phone. "They actually did it," she said. "The system responded. They shut Skynova out." Frank looked up from his coffee. "They followed the protocol?" She nodded, proud, exactly like it was written. He exhaled, slow, quiet, the kind of breath that had waited decades to believe systems could work for people like him. But then he asked, "And what happened to the gate agent?" Jessica hesitated. "They reassigned her, quietly." Frank's face hardened just slightly. "Then the work isn't done." Across the country, airline boards scrambled. Internal memos warned staff that compliance lapses now carry operational consequences. Legal departments began rewriting training manuals. PR teams crafted public apology templates in advance. And quietly, many airline execs whispered the same phrase, "Don't be the next Skynova." Meanwhile, Frank received an invitation, hand-delivered, embossed, formal. National Transportation Leadership Summit, Washington, D.C. Keynote speaker Colonel Frank Delaney, return, topic, Passenger Dignity and Federal Ethics in Modern Aviation. He sat in silence, holding the envelope. Jessica, watching from the kitchen, raised an eyebrow. "You going?" Frank looked up. "I've spent my whole life talking when ordered to. This one, I'll do on my own terms." The summit was held at the Eisenhower Building, a grand ballroom lined with gold trim, American flags, and 300 chairs filled with officials, executives, and policy minds. Frank stood at the podium in a simple gray suit. No medals, no flair, just a black cane resting by his side, and a story the entire room already knew. "I've been asked," he began, "why I stayed quiet on that flight, why I didn't argue or demand a supervisor." He paused. "I didn't stay quiet because I was afraid. I stayed quiet because I was tired." Murmurs rippled across the crowd. Tired of explaining my service. Tired of proving my dignity. Tired of pretending that asking to be treated like a human being makes me a problem. He scanned the room. And that exhaustion? It's not just mine. It belongs to every elder, every disabled vet, every single passenger who's been told, "You're not a priority today." He stepped back for a moment. Let the words hang. I didn't write this protocol to punish airlines. I wrote it to remind them. To remind them that silence is not the absence of harm. And sometimes, the person you push aside isn't just a passenger. Sometimes, they're the one holding your future in their hands. The audience didn't clap right away. They just stood, quiet, still, until one man, an airline CEO, rose first, hand on chest. Then others followed. It wasn't a salute, but it wasn't applause either. It was recognition, and that meant more. The next day, 5 major airlines released a joint statement. In full alignment with the Delaney Protocol, we commit to passenger dignity as a standard, not a slogan. That same week, the FAA created a real-time public dashboard showing airline ethics scores, updated daily. And one more name was quietly added to the summit's planning committee for next year. Colonel Frank Delaney, honorary chair back in Rock Springs. Frank didn't celebrate. He didn't post on social media. He didn't take interviews. But the next time he boarded a plane, the gate agent looked up at his boarding pass, then at him, then stood and said, "Mr. Delaney, your seat is ready." And sir, thank you. Frank nodded once, and for the first time in years, he sat, without explaining a thing. Not everyone was happy about the Delaney Protocol. Inside the sleek executive suite of Northway Aero, CEO Spencer Rourke slammed a copy of the Wall Street Journal on the table. The headline read, "3 airlines now face suspension over ethics violations. FAA tightens grip." "This is insane," Rourke growled. "One old man gets told to move, and now we're rewriting aviation policy?" His CFO, Marcia Lynn, tried to steady him. "We're losing contractor confidence, and our ethics score dropped last night. Did you see?" "I saw it," he snapped. "This whole thing is political theater." But it wasn't. Across the industry, Delaney's name had become shorthand for accountability. The public called it the seat standard. Veterans groups tracked each airline's compliance in real time. And when a video emerged of a Skybridge employee telling a pregnant woman to wait her turn, despite her medical boarding rights, Twitter exploded. #Delaney did warn. Then within hours, Skybridge's ethics score dropped below compliance. FAA triggered a 24-hour contract freeze. Flights were rerouted. Cargo diverted. Millions lost. In retaliation, a coalition of 5 airlines hired a lobbying firm to challenge the protocol in court. They argued it infringed on private sector decision-making autonomy. But Charlotte Hayes had anticipated that. She published a second article, "The Cost of Dignity: Why Compliance Isn't Optional." She included data showing how every ethics-related suspension saved federal agencies money by avoiding lawsuits, delays, and public backlash. It went viral. Frank read it from his porch, sipping coffee. Jessica texted, "She nuked them," in 3 paragraphs. Frank didn't reply, but he smiled. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. FAA Deputy Director Angela Lynn found herself summoned to a private meeting with Senate aides, some clearly under airline influence. One of them, a young man in an expensive suit, leaned across the table and asked, "Don't you think this protocol gives too much power to passengers?" Angela didn't flinch. "I think passengers were the last group in aviation with no power at all." He leaned back, silent. Meanwhile, Frank received a phone call. Not from the FAA, not from DOD, from the White House. A senior ethics advisor requested a quiet, informal meeting. "Nothing public," she said. "But the administration wants to understand what happened, firsthand." Frank met her 2 days later in a private room near the Capitol. He told the story plainly. He didn't dramatize, didn't preach. He just explained what it felt like to be moved, dismissed, and saluted, all in under 15 minutes. When he finished, she said, "We're drafting language. It won't be called the Delaney Act, but—" Frank raised a brow. She smiled. "It will carry your values." On a stormy Tuesday, the FAA held a press conference. Standing behind the podium, Angela Lin announced, "As of today, the Passenger Dignity and Compliance Enforcement Framework is officially adopted as federal regulation, binding across all federally contracted airlines." The room fell quiet. She continued, "This framework is inspired by and named in honor of Colonel Frank Delaney, and going forward, every seat, every request, and every passenger will be treated with the respect they've always deserved." That night at home in Rock Springs, Frank didn't turn on the TV. He just sat by the window, watching the wind move through the pine trees. He wasn't a man who sought legacy, but legacy had found him. Not in the medals on his wall, not in the protocol that bore his name, but in the quiet understanding that he had stood for something. And because he stood, millions would sit, without fear, without shame, with dignity. 3 weeks after the Delaney framework became law, cracks began to show, but not in the system, in the people behind it. Charlotte Hayes was at her desk when a plain envelope showed up in her inbox. No return address. Inside, a flash drive and a single typed note. "They're gutting it from the inside. Protect what matters." She plugged it in. No malware, just one folder. Sky Ethics is internal. Click. Inside were folders of confidential recordings, heavily redlined policy drafts, internal memos between executives of major airlines, each pointing to a coordinated effort to quietly dismantle the Delaney framework. One email stood out. "Reframe dignity as a service recommendation, not a federal mandate. Target clauses that allow passenger-triggered escalations." Charlotte froze, then hit record on her phone. "This isn't sabotage," she whispered. "This is a coup." Across the country, in a dim operations room, deep inside Skybridge HQ, 6 men sat around a table lined with confidential papers, phones in Faraday bags. Todd Vickers, Senior VP of Operations, leaned over his coffee. "We're not killing the protocol. We're adjusting it. Strip the teeth, leave the shell. PR safe." The legal rep nodded. "We've already sent new clause language to our FAA contact for review. It'll slide under the radar if no one makes noise." Another executive grinned. "Passengers think they won. Let them. By next fiscal year, we'll be back to business as usual." They raised their cups, quiet, arrogant. What they didn't know, someone in that room was no longer on their side. Charlotte flew to DC with the drive in hand. Frank met her in a quiet cafe by Rock Creek Park. No press, no aides. Just 2 people who'd seen too much. She laid the drive on the table. "They're not fighting in court, they're carving it up behind closed doors." Frank didn't speak for a long moment. He just scrolled through the memos, one after another. Finally, he looked up, jaw set. "We need this exposed. Not through rumor, through proof." Charlotte's eyes sharpened. "I have a source inside FAA. Compliance desk. She's scared, but she's ready." Frank's voice was calm. "Let's get her out." 2 nights later, Jessica met the whistleblower in an underground parking lot. The woman, early 40s, anxious, looked over her shoulder twice before speaking. "This," she whispered, handing over a folder, "is everything." Inside, policy draft versions, internal FAA emails showing edits traced back to airline legal teams, audio files of backroom strategy calls. Jessica asked quietly, "Why are you risking your job?" The woman teared up. "My dad was Army. He flew back home in a box after 2 airlines delayed his unit in Kuwait for 3 days. No food, no water, no apologies. This protocol meant something." Jessica said nothing. She just hugged her. The next morning, the core team gathered. Charlotte, Jessica, and Frank. They spread out the files in a hotel conference room. Printed charts, highlighted excerpts, audio transcriptions. Charlotte nodded. "We publish. Tonight." At 9:03 p.m., the Atlantic Ledger dropped the story. Sabotage from 30,000 feet, how airlines are quietly dismantling passenger rights. It hit hard. Screenshots, memos, names, faces. One recording featured Todd Vickers laughing on a call. Passenger dignity expires after boarding. They signed their rights away when they buckled in. Within hours, #Delaney sabotage trended across every major platform. Veterans groups issued joint statements of outrage. Influencers called for boycotts. Even bipartisan members of Congress demanded hearings, and then the hammer dropped. White House press secretary held an emergency briefing. The administration fully supports the Delaney framework. Any attempts to undermine it, covertly or otherwise, will be met with legal consequences. By 3:00 p.m., FAA Director Angela Lin announced, 5 executives across 3 airlines are suspended pending federal ethics review. Todd Vickers was escorted out of Skybridge HQ by 2 U.S. Marshals. Frank said nothing to the media. He stayed home, mowed the lawn, drank his coffee. When a reporter from CBS knocked on his door, he didn't open it. But a week later, a knock came. Not from a camera. A little girl stood outside, maybe 6. Freckles, holding a crumpled piece of paper. A drawing of a plane with the words, "Thank you for helping my mom sit with me." Frank stared at the note, silent, then knelt down and said gently, "You're welcome, sweetheart." The fight wasn't over, but the sabotage had failed. Not because of outrage, or fury, or politics, but because one man stood, and the right people stood with him. 6 weeks after the exposé shook the aviation world, the Senate Ethics and Transportation Committee held its most anticipated hearing in over a decade. The witness, Franklin Delaney. As he walked into the marbled hearing chamber, cameras flashed, reporters whispered, senators stared. But Frank's steps were even, measured. He wasn't here to perform. He was here to finish something. Behind him sat Charlotte, Jessica, and the whistleblower, now under federal protection. In the crowd were veterans, parents, and passengers who had emailed, called, and marched in support of the framework. They didn't clap, they didn't shout, they stood. Frank took his seat. Senator Colleen Vargas, chair of the committee, adjusted her mic. "Mr. Delaney, the floor is yours." Frank looked at her, then scanned the room. For too long, flying in this country has been treated as a privilege for the quiet, the wealthy, and the unquestioning. But air travel is not a luxury. It's public access to time, to family, to safety, to dignity. He paused. When we deny that dignity, not just to soldiers or seniors, but to anyone, we're not just violating ethics. We're violating who we claim to be. The room was still. Over the next hour, Frank laid out the sabotage plot in detail. Names, companies, tactics. He introduced the FAA analyst, who testified under oath about coerced edits and financial kickbacks. Then came Charlotte, who detailed the media blackout threats. Jessica presented internal memos showing coordinated dilution of dignity clauses. Each word was sharp, documented, undeniable. Then came a surprise. A second whistleblower emerged, a former airline HR exec, confirming that flight attendants were being trained to reframe conflict as non-reportable. A senator from Wisconsin leaned forward. "Are you saying airlines told crews to avoid documenting dignity violations?" The whistleblower nodded. Yes, some were even incentivized. Gasps echoed. At the end of the testimony, Senator Vargas leaned back. "Mr. Delaney, in your opinion, what happens if we do nothing?" Frank's eyes didn't blink. "Then the system doesn't just fail. It teaches people to stop believing in it." Vargas nodded once, then turned to the committee. "I move to present the Passenger Dignity Act to the full Senate." The vote passed, unanimously. 3 days later, the Passenger Dignity Act became law. Unlike the Delaney framework, this was no executive policy. It was federal statute, signed by the President, enforced by the Department of Transportation and the FAA. Key provisions included mandatory dignity training for all flight and gate crew, a public-facing ethics compliance dashboard for every airline, a federal ombudsman for passenger rights, real-time in-flight incident reporting linked to FAA review automatic fines for documented dignity violations. The act had teeth. Fallout came fast. 3 CEOs resigned. 9 board members were ousted. Airline lobbyists were subpoenaed. And over 120 flights were restructured to comply with the Act's accessibility and dignity standards. But something deeper shifted. At LAX, a young mom and her child were moved to the front. Not because they asked, but because a crew member quietly said, "This one's on us. No reason you should struggle." In Dallas, a Vietnam veteran was offered help before he asked. A quiet nod, a handshake, no ceremony. Just respect. And on a flight from New York to Phoenix, a teenage girl in a wheelchair didn't have to explain herself. The attendant simply said, "I read your needs. You're good. Just rest." Change wasn't loud. It was consistent. Frank didn't return to public life. He didn't sign book deals, didn't give speeches, but every month, a new letter arrived at his door. From a child, a mother, a pilot, all saying the same thing: "Thank you." And each time, Frank would sit on his porch, coffee in hand, and read the letters slowly, sometimes smiling, sometimes crying, but always feeling one thing: closure. And in the National Museum of Aviation in DC, beside a new exhibit on ethics in the sky, a single plaque hangs on the wall: "To Franklin Delaney, who reminded America that dignity should never need a boarding pass." 6 months had passed since the Passenger Dignity Act reshaped the airline industry, and the echoes of that single flight from Denver to Atlanta still lingered far beyond the tarmac. Franklin Delaney hadn't boarded a plane since, not because he feared it, but because he no longer had to. He had spent his entire life on the road, in the air, chasing contracts and navigating silence. Now, silence finally felt like peace. He lived quietly on his farm in Asheville, North Carolina, the same house he'd built with his late wife, surrounded by trees that still remembered their laughter. Every morning, he walked to the edge of his field with a cane carved by a veteran who once sat next to him on a return flight from Kandahar. One crisp November morning, Frank stood by the mailbox. Inside, a letter. The return address was from a high school in Arizona. The envelope was thick, slightly wrinkled. No return name. He opened it slowly. Inside was a handwritten note in purple ink. "Mr. Delaney, my name is Amara Jennings. I'm 17 and I want to be a pilot. My uncle uses a wheelchair and he says flying is the only time he feels truly small, in a bad way. But now, things feel different. We studied your story in civics class. You made me believe one voice can change a system, so I started a petition to name our flight program after you. We hope you'll visit." Attached, a copy of the petition, signed by 212 students and staff. Frank stared at the page, then smiled, just a little. Meanwhile, the industry kept shifting. The FAA launched the Delaney Index, a public scoring system grading airlines on dignity metrics. Passengers could now track how each airline handled complaints, accessibility, and in-flight respect. A new app emerged, Sky Truth. With a single tap, travelers could log dignity violations, automatically linked to federal systems. But more powerful than policy or tech were the stories. One went viral. A former gate agent from JFK revealed she was trained to flag passengers who looked difficult. She had quit, then returned, this time as the new director of passenger ethics. Her first act? Hiring a veteran to train every agent on invisible dignity, how to recognize trauma without making it a spectacle. Frank never took credit. When journalists reached out, he declined politely. When book agents offered deals, he forwarded them to Charlotte. When asked how he felt about being called the man who grounded the sky, he chuckled. "I didn't ground anything," he once told a neighbor. "I just stopped letting people look away." One spring afternoon, Charlotte came by the farm. She brought a small gift, a framed photo of the crew that had publicly apologized and later helped lead national training. Frank placed it beside a photo of his wife. "That's the real change," he said. "Not punishment, redemption." Charlotte nodded. "You gave people the courage to stand still long enough to see." That same month, at a university graduation in D.C., the valedictorian, a Somali-American girl, stood at the podium. Her mother had once been denied boarding because she didn't speak English. Now, her daughter delivered a speech titled, "My accent is not a delay," and closed with this line: "Some say justice moves slow, but maybe that's because it waits for someone to refuse their assigned seat." The crowd stood in silence before they roared. Back home, Frank kept a quiet rhythm: coffee on the porch, tending tomatoes, feeding stray dogs who refused to leave. He didn't need a statue, didn't want one. But one evening, flipping through the local news, something caught his eye. A small airport in Oregon had just been renamed Delaney Regional. No press release, no ribbon cutting, just a quiet plaque by the main gate. When asked why, the airport director said, "Because we wanted everyone to land somewhere where they're seen." Frank didn't cry, but he didn't speak for a long time either. The final scene is not grand. A flight takes off. A flight attendant kneels to speak gently to a nervous child. A pilot walks through the terminal and salutes an old man in uniform, without being told to. No hashtags, no speeches, just a ripple. That never stopped moving. And in that silence, America finally remembered what flying was supposed to feel like. The screen fades to black, then slowly fades in again. Night. Quiet. Rain tapping softly against the window of a small airport lounge in Asheville. Franklin Delaney is sitting alone in a worn leather chair, holding a boarding pass. Not for travel, but for tribute. An invitation. Federal Ethics Summit, Washington, D.C. Keynote: The Quiet Power of Refusing to Move. Charlotte had submitted the nomination behind his back. The committee voted unanimously. Frank sighs, brushing his fingers over the card. Then he folds it and puts it in his coat. Cut to Gate A4, Asheville Airport. Frank steps onto the jet bridge. A young agent, barely 22, pauses as she scans his pass. Her eyes widen. "Are you Mr. Delaney?" Frank just gives a half smile. "Just Franklin, ma'am." She gently taps the scanner. "Welcome aboard, sir. We saved your seat." He nods, then walks down the aisle, steady on his cane. This time, no one asks him to move. This time, the seat has his name already stitched into the headrest. As the camera pulls back, we see a framed plaque just past the gate. "Let no passenger be unseen. Let no voice be lost in altitude. In honor of Franklin Delaney." Fade to black. The sound of takeoff. Then silence. It began quietly. Not with a press conference, not with a scandal, but with a PDF. Released quietly on the FAA website. Then picked up by policy forums, aviation blogs, and finally, national news. The Passenger Dignity Framework. The final version was signed into law as part of the 2026 Aviation Ethics Compliance Act, attached to a transportation spending bill so massive, no one dared vote it down. In the appendix, a name. This framework is adopted in honor of Mr. Franklin Delaney. But that wasn't the real legacy. The real legacy was the Delaney Clause, a binding rule that no airline operating in the U.S. could receive federal funds or airport partnerships unless they passed an annual dignity audit. And that audit? It wasn't just about surveys. It required passenger-submitted reviews, anonymous crew feedback, whistleblower protection, and even video accountability measures. It wasn't a policy. It was a mirror. Charlotte Holloway became the first director of the National Passenger Dignity Office, appointed by the Department of Transportation, confirmed in a 91-9 Senate vote. In her first address, she didn't mention lawsuits or scandals. She talked about her father, how he used to tell her, if you ever see someone being made small, your job is to stand taller. Then she paused. I think Mr. Delaney stood tall so the rest of us could finally stand up. Over 112 airports adopted the Delaney Index in the first year. An airline with a low score? No gate expansion, no TSA fast-track privileges, no eligibility for sustainability subsidies. 3 major airlines were forced into leadership overhauls after failing 2 audits in a row. But the most surprising shift wasn't corporate, it was cultural. Flight schools began incorporating dignity simulation labs, where students had to role-play real-life dilemmas. A mother with a screaming child, a veteran with mobility issues, a refugee in panic. The most elite score? The Franklin Pin, awarded only to students who passed the course with unanimous respect votes from both peers and instructors. By year 2, airlines began recruiting specifically from the Pin list. Passengers noticed the difference. One day, a viral video surfaced of a young pilot, early 30s, calm and composed, gently kneeling beside an elderly man struggling with a seatbelt. He smiled and said, "Take your time, sir. No one takes off until you're good." It got 22 million views in 3 days. Underneath, someone commented, "His badge has the Franklin Pin. That explains everything." But the system wasn't just built on behavior, it was built on accountability. The ClearFly Ethics dashboard, linked to every airport and major airline, allowed the public to track in real time which airlines had rising or dropping dignity scores, how many unresolved complaints were open, and whether whistleblower protections were actually enforced. Passengers were no longer powerless. One woman, a cancer survivor from Ohio, flagged her mistreatment on a flight. 10 days later, the airline CEO personally apologized and updated its policy manual, not because it was trending, but because the system required it. Frank never saw the framework in action, but he didn't need to, because what mattered wasn't the paper, it was the people. At his funeral, there were no suits, no flags, just hats, veterans' hats, mechanic caps, service uniforms, people who remembered. A stewardess who whispered she'd once served him cold coffee, then watched him tip her anyway. A TSA agent who cried as she told Charlotte, he was the only one who ever said thank you for the pat-down. They played no anthem, but they played a flight announcement, an actual one. Now boarding, Flight 204, final stop, Dignity. Everyone stood. No one moved. At the very end, the FAA quietly installed one final plaque, hidden at the end of Terminal C, Atlanta Airport. Not at eye level, not flashy, just low enough so that children could see it. It read, "This system remembers, even if others forget, in memory of the man who didn't stand when ordered, and taught us why that matters." Have you ever witnessed someone being treated unfairly while flying? Maybe you stayed quiet. Maybe you spoke up. Or maybe you were the one treated unfairly, like Mr. Delaney. Tell us where you're watching from and share your story in the comments. Someone might read it and finally feel seen.